Good day, everyone. My topic is all about the Section 1 and the Section 2 of Chapter 9, Industrialization and Nationalism, which is under the Unit 4, An Era of European Imperialism. By the way, my name is Christine Joyce Almalyari, your next discussant for today. As we discuss in this chapter, these are the key events in the development of industrialization and nationalism. First, the Industrial Revolution saw a shift from an economy based on farming and handicrafts to an economy based on manufacturing by machines and industrial factories. The three important ideologies, conservatism, nationalism, and liberalism, which emerged to play an important role in world history. And lastly, romanticism and realism, reflected changes in society in Europe and North America. Let's begin to the section 1, the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. The Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain in the 1780s and took several decades to spread to other Western nations. Several factors contributed to make Great Britain the starting place. First, agricultural practices in the 18th century had changed. Expansion of farmland, good weather, improved transportation, and new crops, such as the potato, led to a dramatic increase in the food supply. More people could be fed at lower prices with less labor. Now, even ordinary British families could use some of their income to buy manufactured goods. Second, with more abundant food supplies, the population grew. This increase created a large labor force to work in the new factories that were emerging in Great Britain. Third, Britain had a ready supply of money, or capital, to invest in the new industrial machines and the factories needed to house them. Many British people were very wealthy. Some, called entrepreneurs, were interested in finding new business opportunities and new ways to make profits. Fourth, natural resources were plentiful in Britain. The country's many rivers provided water power and the means for transporting raw materials and finished products from one place to another. Britain also had abundant supplies of coal and iron ore, essential in manufacturing processes. And finally, a supply of markets gave British manufacturers a ready outlet for their goods. Britain had a vast colonial empire, and British ships could transport goods anywhere in the world. In addition, because of population growth and cheaper food at home, domestic markets were increasing. A growing demand for cotton cloth led British manufacturers to begin to look for ways to increase production. The changes in cotton production. In the 18th century, Great Britain had surged ahead in the production of inexpensive cotton goods. The manufacture of cotton cloth was a two-step process. First, spinners made cotton thread from raw cotton. Then, weavers wove the thread into cloth and looms. In the 18th century, these tasks were done by individuals in their rural homes, a production method known as cottage industry. A series of technological advances in the 18th century made cottage industry inefficient. First, the invention of the flying shuttle made weaving faster. Now, weavers needed more thread from spinners because they could produce cloth at a faster rate. In 1764, James Hargreaves had invented a spinning machine called the spinning jenny, which met this need. Other investors made similar contributions. The spinning process became much faster. In fact, thread was being produced faster than weavers could use it. Another invention made it possible for the weaving of cloth to catch up with the spinning of thread. This was a water-powered loom invented by Edmund Cartwright by 1787. It now became more efficient to bring workers to the new machines and have them work in factories near streams and rivers, which were used to power many of the early machines. The cotton industry became even more productive when the steam engine was improved in the 1760s by a Scottish engineer, James Watt. In 1782, Watt made changes that enabled the engine to drive machinery. Steam power could now be used to spin and weave cotton. Before long, cotton mills using steam engines were found all over Britain. Because steam engines were fired by coal, they did not need to be located near rivers. British cotton cloth production increased dramatically. In 1760, Britain had imported 2.5 million pounds of raw cotton, which was used to produce cloth in cottage industries. In 1787, the British imported 22 million pounds of cotton, most of it spun on machines. By 1840, 366 million pounds of cotton were imported each year. By this time, cotton cloth was Britain's most valuable product. British cotton goods were sold everywhere in the world and were produced mainly in factories. Next, the coal and iron industries. The steam engine was crucial to Britain's industrial revolution. For fuel, the engine depended on coal, a substance that seemed to be unlimited in quantity. The success of the steam engine increased the need for coal and led to an expansion in coal production. New processes using coal aided the transformation of another industry, the iron industry. Britain's natural resources included large supplies of iron ore. At the beginning of the 18th century, the basic process of producing iron had changed little since the Middle Ages. It became possible to produce a better quality of iron in the 1780s, when Henry Cort developed a process called puddling. In this process, coke, which was derived from coal, was used to burn away impurities in crude iron, cold pig iron, and produce an iron of high quality. The British iron industry boomed. In 1740, Britain had produced 17,000 tons of iron. After quartz process came into use in the 1780s, production jumped to nearly 70,000 tons. In 1852, Britain produced almost 3 million tons more iron than was produced by the rest of the world combined. The high-quality iron was used to build new machines, especially new means of transportations. In the 18th century, more efficient means of moving resources and goods developed. Railroads were particularly important to the success of the Industrial Revolution. In 1804, the first steam-powered locomotive ran on an industrial rail line in Britain. It pulled 10 tons of ore and 70 people at 5 miles per hour. Better locomotives followed. One called the Rocket was used on the first public railway line, which opened in 1830 and extended 32 miles from Liverpool to Manchester, England. The rocket sped along at 16 miles per hour while pulling a 40-ton train. Within 20 years, locomotives were able to reach 50 miles per hour, an incredible speed to passengers. In 1840, Britain had almost 2,000 miles of railroads. By 1850, more than 6,000 miles of railroads track crisscross much of that country. Building railroads created new jobs for farm laborers and peasants. Less expensive transportation led to lower priced goods, thus creating larger markets. More sales meant more factories and more machinery. Business owners could reinvest their profits in new equipment, adding to the growth of the economy. This type of regular ongoing economic growth became a basic feature of the new industrial economy. The new factories. The factory was another important element in the Industrial Revolution. From its beginning, the factory created a new labor system. Factory owners wanted to use their new machines constantly. So, workers were forced to work in shifts to keep the machines producing at a steady rate. Early factory workers came from rural areas, where they were used to periods of hectic work, followed by periods of inactivity. Early factory owners therefore had to create a system of work discipline in which employees became used to working regular hours and doing the same work over and over. The spread of industrialization. By the mid-19th century, Great Britain had become the world's first and richest industrial nation. It produced one half of the world's coal and manufactured goods. Its cotton industry alone in 1850 was equal in size to the industries of all other European countries combined. In Europe, the Industrial Revolution spread to the rest of Europe at different times and speeds. First, to industrialize In continental Europe were Belgium, France, and the German states. In these places, governments were very active in encouraging the development of industrialization. In North America, an industrial revolution also occurred in the new nation of the United States. In 1800s, 6 out of every 7 American workers were farmers, and there were no cities with more than 100,000 people. Between 1800s and 1860, the population in the United States grew from about 5 million to 30 million people. Cities grew too. 9 cities had populations over 100,000. Only 50% of American workers were farmers. The United States was a large country in the 1800s. A transportation system to move goods across the nation was vital. Thousands of miles of roads and canals were built to link east and west. Most important in the development of an American transportation system was the railroad. It began with fewer than 100 miles of track in 1830. By 1860, about 30,000 miles of railroad track covered the United States. The railroad turned the United States into a single massive market for the manufactured goods of the Northeast. Labor for the growing number of factories in the Northeast came chiefly from the farm population. Indeed, women and girls made up a substantial majority of the workers in large textile factories. Factory owners sometimes sought entire families, including children, to work in their factories. As we see this comparison, keep in mind the vast difference in area encompassed by Britain and the United States. Britain, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland totals 94,548 square miles, while the continental United States totals 3,717,796 square miles. The social impact in Europe. The Industrial Revolution drastically changed the social life of Europe and the world. This change was evident in the first half of the 19th century in the growth of cities and the emergence of two new social classes, the industrial middle class and the industrial working class. The growth of population and cities. In 1750, European population stood at an estimated 140 million. By 1850, the population had almost doubled to 266 million. The key to this growth was a decline in death rates, wars, and diseases such as smallpox and plague. The rapid growth of cities in the first half of the 19th century led to pitiful living conditions for many of the inhabitants. Eventually, these conditions prompted urban reformers to call on local governments to clean up their cities. Next, the industrial middle class. The Middle Ages had seen the rise of commercial capitalism, an economic system based on trade. With the Industrial Revolution came the rise of industrial capitalism, an economic system based on industrial production. Industrial capitalism produced a new middle class group, the industrial middle class. In the Middle Ages, the bourgeoisie or middle class person was the burgher or town dweller who may have been active as a merchant, official, artisan, lawyer, or intellectual. The new industrial middle class was made up of the people who built the factories, bought the machines, and figured out where the markets were. However, the Industrial Revolution also created an industrial working class. Industrial workers face stretched working conditions. Work hours range from 12 to 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, with a half hour for lunch and dinner. There was no security of employment and no minimum wage. Early socialism was largely the idea of intellectuals who believed in the quality of all people and who wanted to replace competition with cooperation in industry. To later socialists, especially the followers of Karl Marx, such as the idea were merely impractical dreams. The later socialists contemptuously labeled the earlier theories utopian socialists. The term has lasted to this day. Robert Owen, a British cotton manufacturer, was one utopian socialist. He believed that humans would show their natural goodness if they live in a cooperative environment. Now, Let's move on to the section 2, Reaction and Revolution. The Congress of Vienna. After the defeat of Napoleon, European rulers moved to restore the old order. This was the goal of the great powers Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia when they met at the Congress of Vienna in September 1814 to arrange a final peace settlement. The great powers rearranged territories in Europe, believing that this would form a new balance of power. The powers at Vienna wanted to keep any one country from dominating Europe. This meant balancing political and military forces that guaranteed the independence of the great powers. To balance Russian territorial gains, for example, new territories were given to Prussia and Austria. The conservative order. The arrangements worked out at the Congress of Vienna were a victory for rulers who wanted to contain the forces of change unleashed by the French Revolution. These rulers, like Metternich, believed in the political philosophy known as conservatism. Conservatism is based on tradition and social stability. Most conservatives at that time favored obedience to political authority and believed that organized religion was crucial to order in society. Conservatives hated revolutions and were unwilling to accept demands from people who wanted earlier individual rights through representative governments. Eventually, the great powers adopted a principle of intervention. According to this principle, the great powers had the right to send armies into countries where there were revolutions in order to stamp legitimate monarchs to their thrones. The forces of change. Between 1815 and 1830, conservative governments throughout Europe worked to maintain the old order. However, powerful forces for change, known as liberalism and nationalism, were also at work. First, liberalism. It is a political philosophy based largely on Enlightenment principles held that people should be as free as possible from government restraint. Liberals had a common set of political beliefs. Chief among them was the protection of civil liberties or the basic rights of all people. Liberals believed that all these freedoms should be guaranteed by a written document such as the American Bill of Rights. Liberals did not, however, believe in a democracy in which everyone had the right to vote. They thought that the right to vote and hold office should be open only to men of property. Liberalism then was tied to middle class men, especially industrial middle class men. Nationalism was an event more powerful for change in the 19th century than was liberalism. Nationalism arose out of people's awareness of being part of a community with common institutions, traditions, language, and customs. This community is called a nation. For nationalists, people owe their chief political loyalty to the nation rather than to a dynasty, city-state, or other political unit. Nationalism did not become a popular force for change until the French Revolution. From then on, nationalists came to believe that each nationality should have its own government. Nationalism then was a threat to existing political order. A united Germany, for example, would upset the balance of power set at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. At the same time, an independent Hungarian state would mean the breakup of the Austrian Empire. The Revolutionary Outburst. Beginning in 1830, the forces of change, liberalism, and nationalism began to break through the conservative domination of Europe. In France, liberals overthrew the Bourbon monarchs, Charles X in 1830 and established a constitutional monarchy. Political support for the new monarch, Louis Philippe, a cousin of Charles X, came from the upper middle class. Nationalism was the chief force in three other revolutions the same year. However, the forces of liberalism and nationalism continued to grow. These forces of change erupted once more in the revolutions of 1848. Another French Revolution. Revolution in France was again the spark for revolution in other countries. Severe economic problems beginning in 1846 brought untold hardship in France to the lower middle class, workers, and peasants. At the same time, members of the middle class clamored for the right to vote. The government of Louis Philippe refused to make changes, and opposition grew. The monarchy was finally overthrown in 1848. A group of moderate and radical Republicans set up a provisional or temporary government. The Republicans were people who wished France to be a republic, a government in which leaders are elected. The new constitution ratified on November 4, 1848, set up a republic called the Second Republic. The Second Republic had a single legislature elected by universal male suffrage. However, there is also trouble in the German states. News of the 1848 revolution in France led to upheaval in other parts of Europe. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 had recognized the existence of 38 independent German states called the German Confederation. Of these, Austria and Prussia were the two great powers. The other states varied in size. In 1848, cries for change led many German rulers to promise constitutions, a free press, and jury trials. Indeed, an all-German parliament, called the Frankfurt Assembly, was held to fulfill a liberal and nationalist dream, the preparation of a constitution for a new united Germany. However, the Frankfurt Assembly failed to achieve its goal. The members drafted a constitution but had no real means of forcing the German rulers to accept it. German unification was not achieved. Revolutions in Central Europe. The Austrian Empire also had its problem. The empire was a multinational state, a collection of different peoples including Germans, Czechs, Magyars, Slovaks, Romanians, Slovenes, Poles, Croats, Serbians, and Italians. Only the Habsburg Emperor provided a common bond. In Vienna, revolutionary forces took control of the capital and demanded a liberal constitution. To appease the revolutionaries, the government gave Hungary its own legislature. In Bohemia, the Czechs clamored for their own government. By the end of October, the rebels in Vienna had been defeated as well. With the help of a Russian army of 140,000 men, the Hungarian revolutionaries were finally subdued in 1849. The revolutions in the Austrian Empire had failed. Lastly, the revolts in the Italian states. The Congress of Vienna had set up 9 states in Italy, including the Kingdom of Piedmont in the north, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the Naples and Sicily, the Papal States, a handful of small states, and the northern provinces of Lombardy and Venetia, which were now part of the Austrian Empire. In 1848, a revolt broke out against the Austrians in Lombardy and Venetia. Revolutionaries in other Italian states also took up arms and sought to create liberal constitutions and they unified Italy. By 1849, however, the Austrians had re-established complete control over Lombardy and Venetia. The old order also prevailed in the rest of Italy. Throughout Europe in 1848, popular revolts started upheavals that had led to liberal constitutions and liberal governments. However, moderate liberals and more radical revolutionaries were soon divided over their goals, and so conservative rule was re-established. Even with the re-establishment of conservative governments, however, the forces of nationalism and liberalism continued to influence political events. And that's it. I hope you understand and learn something about my topic. Thank you and God bless us all.